Well, great. Well, welcome everyone to our event, The Future of Conservatism After Trump. My name is Chloe Knox, and I'm the Vice President for Speakers for UVA's Federalist Society chapter. The Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. Today, we're joined by Oren Cass and Professors Brad Wilcox and Julia Mahoney. Oren Cass is the Executive Director of American Compass. From 2015 to 2019, he was a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he regularly writes for publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. His 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, has been called the essential policy book for our time. Mr. Cass served as the Domestic Policy Director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. He graduated from Harvard Law School, where he served as an editor on the Harvard Law Review. Brad Wilcox is the director of the National Marriage Project and a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. He also serves as a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. His research on marriage, parenthood, and the stability of family life has appeared in numerous media outlets, and he consults regularly with major companies on fertility and marriage trends in the United States. Professor Wilcox was a Jefferson Scholar at the University of Virginia and went on to earn his PhD from Princeton. Julia Mahoney is the John S. Battle Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law and the co-chair of the Federalist Society's Senior Scholars Advisory Board. Her current scholarly research includes projects on eminent domain, takings litigation in the federal courts, and constitutional limitations on the police power. Professor Mahoney received her JD from Yale Law School and practiced in New York before entering the Legal Academy. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I appreciate you guys taking the time. Before I turn it over to Mr. Cass, I'm just going to remind the audience that throughout the panelists' comments, you can submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will return after the panelists have concluded their remarks to facilitate some Q&A. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Cass.
All right, well, thank you for having me. I guess I just realized it's almost been a decade since I graduated from law school, which I realize as the email addresses with the little year numbers at the end keep getting further away from my own, but it always brings back memories to hear the official FedSoc mission statement read at the beginning of each event. At where we were, at least there was always Chick-fil-A. So I hope you are carrying on that tradition in your own ways, in your own homes during this difficult time. So I guess I want to talk a little bit about what conservatism actually is, which would obviously implicate what it might become after Trump. I think there's a lot of confusion over what conservatism is, particularly because if the premise of conservatism is that we are just conserving what we have, then it is almost entirely sort of place and time dependent. And in 1750, you would be a Tory and support the British, and in 1820, you would be I guess, pro-slavery American, and by 1870, you would be an anti-slavery American, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's right. And I think you can look all the way back to Burke, who's sort of the original modern conservative, who very strikingly within a few years supported the American Revolution and opposed the French Revolution. And for one thing, was proved entirely right on both counts, which I think is a great start for conservatism. But it's really important to think and look at why he did that. And his explanation was that in looking at the American context, he felt that the way that the British were treating the Americans was out of line and out of the character of the American people and the nation that they were building, and that they would be better off if allowed to go their own way and continue more in the democratic model they were building. Whereas when he looked at the French Revolution, he saw an effort to tear down all of the viable structures in the society and rightly recognized that would be a disaster. And so I think there is a substance to conservatism that we don't give enough credit to. And probably the reason we don't is that what we call conservatism in America today is not conservative at all. I think, all of our ideologies and partisan groups have a way of falling into their own dogma. The funny thing about American conservative dogma is that there's no conservatism to be found in it. Tax cuts, there are times when a tax cut could be conservative, but there's nothing inherently conservative about tax cuts. Deregulation, free trade, these are libertarian concepts. And so I want to sort of briefly back up and think about how we got to what we call conservatism today, and then look ahead to what it might more promisingly mean in the future. The right of center as we think of it today dates back essentially to the Reagan coalition and what was called, and still is called, fusionism, which was a coalition of economic libertarians, social conservatives, and foreign policy hawks, Cold War hawks in particular. And those three groups have many things in common. They also have some things that they don't agree on at all. But particularly in the context of the Cold War, it made a lot of sense for them to join together. And particularly in the context of America's problems in the late 1970s, they found a lot of common cause. And so in that period, it made a lot of sense. For instance, the things that Reagan was doing, I think were generally, even in hindsight, sensible things to do. And they certainly had a lot of success. They won the Cold War. But in the process, each group sort of became assigned to its own area. And so what we think of as conservative foreign policy is just, at least until recent years, just hawkish, go invade the world foreign policy, which again, not conservative in any meaningful way. What we think of as social policy, it tends to sort of adhere to the views more of the religious right. And then what we think of economic policy is almost entirely libertarian. The actual conservative mode of thinking doesn't really factor into our economic reasoning at all. And I think that's a real problem. And it has shown itself in recent years, where libertarians and conservatives both like markets, but they have very different views on them. Conservatives see markets as a very important institution in the society and a wonderful means to the end of the free society and the stable community and general prosperity. But they like markets because it delivers those things. Whereas I think libertarians are more likely to see the free market as the end unto itself, and either they will simply postulate that it by definition delivers the best outcome, or they will say we don't care whether it delivers the best outcome, the freedom comes first. And in a period when free markets were delivering very good outcomes, you can see why the two thought they saw eye to eye. But really over the last 20 years, and especially in the last 10 since the Great Recession, it's become clear that actually free markets weren't necessarily delivering fully on their promise, certainly not in a broad-based, widespread way. And all of a sudden, these two groups that thought they agreed on everything kind of looked up and realized that actually they didn't. Donald Trump is neither a libertarian nor a conservative, but I think one way to understand his rise up through the Republican Party in 2016 was he sort of just jammed his thumb into that gap and twisted. And so what you had then in Trump was someone who was neither conservative nor libertarian, but was actually talking about some of the problems that had emerged in a way that libertarians had been unwilling to acknowledge or really tackle. And there I'm thinking about, for instance, the effects of globalization, even as it brings us cheaper products and higher standards of living, of really hollowing out parts of the economy, of causing greater levels of disruption. There I'm also thinking of the role that technology has played in a lot of respects in the society. And those are things we actually need to have something to say about. And so I don't think Trump brought us an answer, but I don't remember if it's an analogy or a metaphor, or maybe a simile. Regardless, Trump, if you say like, it's a simile. So this is a simile. Trump was like an earthquake. Earthquakes, for one thing, are huge disasters, obviously, and they knock a lot of things down. But they don't build. No one asks kind of what is the future of the earthquake, or where will the earthquake come, take us next. The value of the earthquake is in exposing what was poorly built, what was outdated, what did not have a strong foundation. And while it is painful and costly in some respects, I think it also provides a real opportunity to do better, to learn, and to build something that's going to be more relevant and lasting. Now, of course, you'll also have people who liked things the way they were and want to charge right back in and put everything back up again. And I think that's the battle that we have now on the right of center, is between what I would call the pre-Trumpists, who thought things were just fine in 2014 and would like to get back to it as soon as they can, and the post-Trumpists who say, no, there's any party that allows Donald Trump to sort of rise up through it and take it over, and frankly has struggled to develop much of a policy agenda at all, needs real reform, and we have to figure out what that should look like. And it is by no means a foregone conclusion that it will look genuinely conservative, but I think that it could. I think there's a real opportunity. So let me now describe kind of what I see as the genuinely conservative path that the right of center could take, and why I think there's a real chance that it is going to reemerge. So what is conservatism? Well, going back to the Burkean definition, conservatives more so than others, and these things are all, of course, shades of each other in various ways. Everyone likes freedom and liberty and social justice and so forth. But relatively speaking, conservatives tend to put a lot more emphasis on institutions. They tend to be a lot more concerned with not just everyone doing whatever they want, but recognizing that civilization and a functioning society is a fragile thing, that the traditions that are built up over time, that the institutions that mediate between us, that form us, are vital to anything working. And so conservatives, I think we tend to be more attuned to and protective of those things, and more wary of potential erosions of them. Now, that doesn't mean we want to go back to the way things were at some prior time. It doesn't mean we don't ever want change, but it means we see change as a more gradual evolutionary process of accumulating and of accumulation and building on what works, not simply complaining about what doesn't work and thinking we could just build something better. I think with that, then, if you think in economic terms, there are a few things that it implies. One is that our economic analysis is going to be a lot more sensitive to the interactions between the formal economy and the rest of society. So policymakers have gotten in the habit of kind of doing what they call scoring, right? So they look at a policy and they have some model in a computer that sort of makes a bunch of assumptions and spits out, here's how much the economy will grow or shrink. Here's the effects on employment. Here's the effects on GDP. Here's the effects on children's learning and fertility. And you can project anything you want. But these tend to be incredibly abstract models, and they tend not to recognize that people are actually people. And for instance, a model of free trade that says, well, that's fine, everything that can be done more cheaply somewhere else will go elsewhere, and the people here will find other more productive things to do. That is what the economic model says. It ignores both that people who suddenly lose their livelihood do not simply go find something else to do, and that investors and their capital are not necessarily going to direct it toward employing those people. And so I think a conservative economics would take a lot more seriously in the economic realm the reality that economic prosperity isn't just these abstract features of capital and labor getting slammed together. It actually depends probably a lot more on, for instance, community health. Whether communities are places that people want to be in and invest in, or that they want to flee, whether they feel like there's places where there is long-term promise, and family health, whether families have the economic stability in which to form and remain intact and raise kids who are going to have the capacity to be productive. Because at the end of the day, the workers you have in your society are again, they're not numbers in a spreadsheet that you can just assign a productivity value to. If you raise them in disrupted environments, you can very well end up with folks who are not going to be productive workers when they come out the other end of it. So thinking much more about those kinds of relationships, I think, is incredibly important. I think another related point is in defining the ends, I think conservatives will have a much better recognition that this isn't just about getting GDP as high as you can and then figuring out how to chop up the pie so everybody has enough. In formal terms, everybody, even the poorest people in America, are much better off than they were in the past, if we're just measuring the amount of stuff they have. But I think we should recognize that is not the right thing to measure, and that, for instance, inequality is not this abstract notion that progressives use to drum up frustration. Inequality matters to people. It matters to their own well-being. It matters to their opportunities. It tears at the social fabric, which is itself a thing of value. So how widespread prosperity is, a place-based view on where growth is happening, a concern for whether there's too much and rising inequality, those are all things that conservatives would take very seriously. One more that I would emphasize is that I think conservatives are going to be especially focused on, non-market issues. Our current model says if we can get 2 parents in every household working full time, we will be richer than ever. And we will be. GDP will be higher. We'll count both of the parents' earnings as GDP, and then we'll count the work of the childcare worker as GDP, and that will be just fantastic. But the reality is that nowhere in any of those models is what is lost, which is the non-market labor that is incredibly valuable to the family itself, but is also the foundation of the community. I mean, if you look at sort of who is going to coach the Little League team, who is going to organize the fundraiser, who is going to sit on the school board, all of those things depend on people not dedicating all of their effort to the labor market. And yet our economics has no way to measure that. And so that's another place I think where conservatives would say the best policies, the things we're aiming for, the things that are going to actually lead to the most prosperity in the long run, look a little different than either what the more libertarian confidence in just the free market would focus on, or what the progressive emphasis on redistribution would take to deliver the right outcomes. So why might this actually work? And this is the last thing I'll say. I think it's really striking to look at the set of problems we actually have today. They are ones that are well suited to conservative responses. And I would say they have emerged in part because conservatives were absent from the playing field. They are the sort of problems you get when the policymaking consensus is sort of halfway between the neoliberal left and the neoliberal right for too long. The rise of China, as an example, is something that neither progressives nor libertarians have really any way of thinking about or even understanding as a problem in a lot of cases, let alone having a nation-based view of how to respond. And so much as the Cold War was a catalyzing feature for the last conservatism, I think competition with China could be this time around. I think the role of technology, and particularly the technology monopolies, are a huge problem. Our basic economics don't cope very well with a situation where most of the profit to be had is in places that sort of default to natural monopoly, and which in the process sort of invade the non-economic public square. And again, I think neither progressives nor libertarians have the toolkit or the vocabulary to describe these problems for what they are, or think about how public power might address them. And then third is just the community problem. I think we both see breakdown in communities generally, and then in particular, we see a concentration of prosperity and growth and wealth and talent in ever narrower segments of the country. And again, this is something that both progressives and libertarians essentially celebrate, either for sort of narrow political reasons or because agglomeration is great for GDP. And I think, again, it is conservatives who are uniquely suited to notice that this is not actually healthy for the country. It's not healthy for families. And ultimately, it's not going to be good for the economy either. And that more conservative thinking, I think, will generate the kinds of policy responses we need. So I'm happy to get more into sort of what some of those policy responses might be, but I will leave it there and I believe hand it over to Brad.
Thanks, Oren. So we're asked to think about sort of the future of the post-Trump conservative movement. And obviously, as we kind of think about Trump, we can recognize the many, many failures that Trump managed to have. And, that's important to acknowledge. But I think going forward, we can also appreciate how Trump's legacy is in some ways helpful. And I would sort of think about this kind of in three ways in particular. So the first way, and this sort of dovetails with what Oren was saying, what we're, I think, moving beyond is sort of a Reaganite devotion to freedom and to a recognition that conservatives can deliberately advance the common good. So that's, and that's in part, I think, a legacy of the way in which sort of Trump dislodged the old kind of Reaganite fusionist, consensus. I think the second thing that we've seen too is that his rise spotlighted the discontents of working class Americans, whose interests have often been ignored, both economically and culturally, by elites who control our C-suites and who control the commanding heights of our culture. And then a third and related point is that Trump helped consolidate a class shift in the Republican electorate away from a kind of country club Republicanism to a kind of Sam's Club Republicanism, to use the term from Ross Douthat and Rehan Salam. So that means, of course, that a majority today of Republican voters, a clear majority, are not college educated or are not well off. So these new realities present a number of opportunities for conservatives and for the Republican Party, opportunities that may or may not be seized by a new generation of political and intellectual leaders in the conservative movement. This is obviously intellectual leaders as different as Oren Cass and Yuval Levin, political leaders as different as Tom Cotton and Mitt Romney. And I think they now have the freedom to take the movement in new directions focused more on advancing the common good and reviving the economic and cultural fortunes of the American working class. I want to kind of think briefly about how this could play out in three different domains: the family, education, what might be called safetyism. So when it comes to family, I think it's important to recognize that we've reached a new nadir in American life with the lowest, I think, marriage and fertility rates will be recorded ever in our nation's history in 2020. And as we kind of look at what's happened to families in the last few decades, in some important ways, the working class has been hit hardest in terms of just the shifts in working class family life, away from marriage, away from stable family life, sort of hit working class Americans particularly hard since the Reagan years, actually. So we have a huge marriage divide now in America, where Americans who have a college degree tend to marry and stay married. By contrast, Americans who don't have a college degree, more working class and poor Americans, tend not to forge stable marriages across the course of their lives. Now, when it comes to family life, Republicans have often talked a good game here, but often not sort of walked a good game, at least on the policy front. And I think what's also the case, and this dovetails too with the point made by Oren, they often have not appreciated how their economic policies, at least in certain cases, have ended up hurting American families, especially working class American families. So for instance, in 2000, many Republican elites joined the push for normalized trade with China. Yet this policy ended up gutting millions of working class jobs, and doing so without policies in place that would have buffered the blows to many of our working class workers in our manufacturing sector. So our elites at this time had kind of a faith, Republican elites, a faith in a kind of a laissez-faire ideology that sees labor markets as automatically self-correcting. But in the real world, this China trade deal exacted a terrible toll on scores of working class families across the US. We know, for instance, from the work of the MIT economist David Autor and from his colleagues that, quote, trade shocks to manufacturing industries have particularly negative impacts on the labor market prospects of men and degrade their marriage market value upon multiple dimensions. Talking here again about the China trade consequence. He says also that it reduced the prevalence of marriage and raised the fraction of children born to young and unwed mothers and living in poor single parent households. So again, the point here is that this trade policy had a pretty big negative impact on millions of working class families across this country. Or we can think about, tax policy in more recent years. So in 2017, when Republicans controlled the presidency and the Congress, they had a chance to reform the tax code. And their focus here was on reducing dramatically corporate tax rates, to 21%. And at this point, they largely ignored a push from Senators Rubio and Lee to focus more of this tax reform on helping working class families with more generous child tax credits. So here again, we have an example of a kind of 80s style conservatism that gives the win to the C-suite crowd, not to Sam's Club Republicans. So thankfully, I think we're actually now seeing some evidence of fresh thinking and fresh policymaking when it comes to family. Oren Cass has recently proposed a kind of a family income security proposal that would lend support to millions of working class and middle class families. And Senator Mitt Romney has proposed a child allowance that would support families up and down the income ladder. So I think we're seeing some fresh thinking on the family front, and I'm hoping that we'll continue to see both this thinking and new policies coming from the right that are designed to help American families, especially working class families. And of course, we are, as I said before, in kind of a fundamental moment of crisis here when it comes to both marriage and fertility. So the time is here really to begin to rebuild our institutions on the family front. When it comes to education, many of my UVA students are surprised to learn that most Americans don't have a bachelor's degree, don't have a college degree. And this is actually particularly true for young men in the US. Only about a third of millennial men, for instance, got a BA or a BS. When you think about American education, what we see is that most public and private high schools overwhelmingly focus their time, their attention, their money, and their prestige on the college track. But we also know that current federal and state funding for higher education totals about $150 billion. And we're only at the same time devoting about $1.9 billion to vocational education, in our high schools and in our community colleges. So this is, I think, an injustice to many young adults who often hail from poor working class homes and are not on this college track. And so as a consequence of this, many of our young adults, especially young men, spend critical years of their schooling, struggling in classes that either bore them or overwhelm them, and fail to offer them a real path to a stable career, much less a sense of vocation and direction. And then, of course, after they graduate from high school, many of these young adults, especially young men, move in and out of dead-end jobs without accumulating the self-confidence and the salary that would prepare them to be good candidates for marriage, among other things. And others drift out of the workforce. Even before the COVID pandemic, nearly 7 million prime-age men in the US were not even looking for work in any meaningful way. So it's sort of in this context, we need to look for alternatives. We need to do more to boost vocational education, which is now called career and technical education. And there are some, I think, promising examples. Take, for instance, career academies. Career academies are specialized learning communities in high schools across the US that offer students rigorous career-oriented courses, as well as on-the-job internships. Young men participating in these programs often earn more than their peers who do not, who are roughly equivalent to them. And they also end up marrying in larger numbers than their peers who did not go through a career academy. So it's these kinds of programs that need to be kind of more the focus of policymakers when it comes to education, both in our schools and at the state and federal levels. And I would specifically recommend that we devote at least 1/3 of federal and state spending when it comes to education to CTE, to internships, and to apprenticeships to kind of rectify this injustice that I think now characterizes our approach to education. So these are the kinds of measures that I think would make our educational policy agenda more likely to advance the common good and also to address the very real educational and even family needs of young adults from working class and poor families. So we need to see more of these kinds of ideas and policy proposals and laws from conservative intellectuals and Republican policymakers. And my final point is about safetyism. And Jonathan Haidt, who used to be here at UVA teaching psychology, has been writing about safetyism for a while now, as probably many of you know. And the point here, right, is that our culture and increasingly our government is focused really like never before on protecting us from physical and now emotional harms. Now, there's a time and place for this, obviously. In COVID time, there are obviously ways in which the government has had to take serious measures to contain and confront the pandemic. But I think all can realize and appreciate how much this impulse to avoid risks can and increasingly is being taken too far. Again, this is what we can call safetyism, to borrow from Jonathan Haidt's terminology. So when it comes to the pandemic, for instance, why is it that so many of our public schools have closed their doors when private schools in their district are running successfully without spreading COVID? This is true, of course, here in Albemarle County and in Charlottesville, where we live and work. Even when public schools just one county over are successfully running, their classes in person. And there's obviously a lot happening here, but part of, I think, what's happening here is this kind of safetyist mentality has come to govern how we're thinking about COVID and a lot of pandemic-related issues. Now, putting aside just COVID, we can think too about how a related dynamic is playing out in many of our universities, community colleges, public schools, and even businesses when it comes to speech that's labeled or experienced as unsafe by some. We know that speakers are canceled, professors are put on leave, and employees are fired for saying things that make others uncomfortable. This is kind of cancel culture action. We've seen this play out, in the last year in places as divergent as the New York Times and the Boeing Corporation, for people saying things that are seen to be kind of unsafe or inappropriate or somehow impolitique. Now, as Rob Patterson, the psychologist, has argued, working class Americans, to kind of bring class point in here again, I think can often have more difficulty navigating these newer safetyist cultural currents because they're not up on all the new terminology and all the sort of developments when it comes to what he calls these kind of more luxury beliefs about how we should use language in very precise and correct ways in this new world. And of course, we also know, too, putting aside the class piece, that conservatives are often more likely to run afoul of this kind of safetyist set of cultural currents playing out in many of our institutions. So on this particular topic, I think the conservatives and Republicans have an opportunity here to champion what Matthew Walther has called barstool conservatism. And in Walther's words, this is where he thinks millions of Americans who share Dave Portnoy, this is the Barstool guy, disdain for the language of liberal improvement, the hectoring, school marmish attitude of Democratic politicians and their allies in the media, and above all, the elevation of risk aversion to the level of first order principle by our professional classes. So again, the point here is that when it comes to safetyism, both kind of in public health, but even more so in some ways in our cultural environs in public institutions, we need to be thinking about how this current is affecting our common life together, and to think about measures we can take to give Americans, a bit more latitude in all of this. Now, I'm not talking here about owning the libs, obviously. What I'm talking about are sort of both policy measures, but I think also willingness to sort of stand up and tell people when we are unwilling to accept some aspect of kind of this new safetyist ethic that is unfolding in our institutions, including here at UVA. So these are, I think, three areas where I think conservative intellectuals and policymakers can make major contributions in the post-Trump era. And of course, only time will tell if they actually seize the initiative when it comes to family, education, and confronting safetyism in America. So thank you.
Thank you. So I will start my brief presentation. I want to leave time for audience questions with a small quibble. I'm not convinced that we are in or even heading toward a true post-Trump era. And I think this for two reasons. The first is, of course, Trump himself. A norm entrepreneur among norm entrepreneurs, Trump is not showing any signs of being interested in retiring quietly from the scene, but rather in making the ex-presidency into a bully pulpit of the sort that, frankly, we have not, I think, yet ever seen in American history. And the second reason is Trump's family. Trump has a lot of children-in-law, and so on. Quite a few of them already are showing some formidable political talents, and Trump does not seem uninterested in founding or overseeing a political dynasty. So I think the Trump earthquake is going to continue, and I think on balance, that is a good thing for conservatism, because I can think of few things more exciting than what we are seeing right now, which is, as Oren and Brad have commented, the twilight of country club republicanism as the affluent suburbs have begun peeling off, the decline of trust in elites and technocracy, and the emergence of, perhaps it's early days, so one has to be, of course, very careful in describing this, the potential emergence of a Republican Party, of a conservative movement that has a very strong working class, multi-ethnic element to it. So looking at what is on the horizon, there are three areas that I think deserve our particular attention and that I am watching particularly closely. The first is, touching on something that Oren was saying earlier, the attention of conservatives to institutions. One thing that I think, anyway, appears to be uniting this emerging new Republican Party is a respect for and an understanding of the importance of institutions being matched to the task at hand. This is something that people who have to actually make their lives work, including small businessmen and women, are naturally very skilled at. They do not tend to fall for utopian schemes, and they tend to understand quite well the dangers of cronyism. So I think about how pragmatic they are and also how respectful they are of institutions having their jobs and of expertise rightly implemented. In particular, one thing that we saw during the Trump era among conservatives and continue to see was a serious commitment to separation of powers, as well as attention to institutional design. Excess executive power was decried by conservatives, even though Trump, their guy up to a point, was in office. I think that this is very important, that conservatives in the United States have shown a great deal of principle when it comes to reining in executive powers and respecting the fact, the idea that institutions, markets, the judiciary, et cetera, have their own areas of ability and competence. The second area that I am watching with great interest is, touching on a lot of what Brad and Oren have already said, this very strong emerging idea that conservatism can promote the common good and that government can be the servant, not the master, but the servant of this promotion of the common good. This is not a conservatism that wants a government, quote, small enough to drown in a bathtub, in Grover Norquist's phrase. This seems to be a conservatism that understands that strong government is necessary in some respects, but that, again, it needs to be, in effect, deployed properly. Will conservatism be able to make this transition to be the party of good government, of right-sized government, of government that can actually deliver? It remains to be seen. But a couple of things I think are worth our attention in thinking about what this right-sized good government conservatism might consist of. One is that the Republican Party's members now are different, and that when we look at various entitlements, in particular Social Security, the expectations of government benefits, which those who have paid into the system believe they have earned, makes up a significantly bigger chunk of their wealth than was the case with, I would say, a lot of years ago. Put slightly differently, the Republican Party is not going to be, at least not to as great an extent, I think, the party of entitlements reform, much less cuts. To the extent that the Republican Party is looking at entitlements reform, it is going to be the party of entitlements conservation so that entitlements are sustainable. Finally, I think we should look very carefully at foreign affairs and America's role in the world. I do not see this emerging conservatism as the Republican Party changes as isolationist And I do not see it, though, as Oren was pointing out, as being a party that, as being a movement that supports unthinking or extensive foreign involvement. I think it is an emerging party, an emerging conservatism that cares a great deal about protecting freedom abroad, that thinks carefully about how to export freedom, but that understands that ideas are often way more powerful than arms. So I see a United States that will not try to withdraw entirely from the world, but will nevertheless be far more mindful and far more choosy about actual American involvement in the world. So in any event, with that, I very much look forward to our audience questions and to the comments of my fellow panelists.
Well, thanks so much for those comments. And audience members, you can continue asking questions. We've got a few lined up, but before we get to those, I'd love to open it up if there's any responses that the panelists had for one another.
Just a quick comment. I was just struck by how much Oren, Julia, and I agree on a lot of the particulars. We did not coordinate ahead of time, but I think it is striking that we're all in our own ways offering a kind of departure from the classic, Reagan fusionist way of approaching these issues. And so, this is just interesting to sort of see a newer way of thinking, represented here today.
Yes,
Yeah, I want. Oh, go ahead, Julia.
No, go ahead, Oren.
Oh, I was just going to say I particularly liked Brad's point about safetyism, which I haven't seen discussed as much, and I think in addition to being really well put, underscores something important about what the future of conservatism might look like on the cultural side, where I think again thinking about what was that Reagan coalition, what we think of as cultural issues. We think of like, oh, that means, abortion and gay marriage, and now, transgender issues or something. And, I think there are some very important issues in there that will remain salient, but I think the nature of the cultural challenges that we have and the way they feed into people's frustrations and the way that they need to be highlighted by a conservative perspective that recognizes the value of doing things the way you've always done it and the way your parents did it, just because that is something that inherently has value to people, just has a lot of potential applications outside of the traditional fights that we're used to having. And I think that they tend to be places where you will find very robust, particularly to Julia's point, if you envision a more multi-ethnic working class conservatism, where you will find very robust majorities for things other than what is standard in the country today, that just aren't represented because neither of the political parties as they're constituted take it to be a serious concern.
Yes, and just to underscore that, the safetyism does not make sense to people who are subject to risks in the way that a lot of this emerging multi-ethnic working class coalition is subject to. It sounds, frankly, almost unbalanced and incoherent, the notion that one can protect oneself, one's society from risk to the extent that affluent suburbanites have come to expect government to be able to protect them from.
Right, we can see this even obviously with the school debate too, where we've got workers who are working obviously in Kroger's and Wegmans, and yet we can't get our teachers to do their work in public schools. So that's one example of what you're talking about, Julia.
Yes, and I think this ties in very much with climate change, which we haven't yet mentioned, but which I think it is the idea that humans can control nature is one that is very much, of course, beloved of, I would say, elites, academic elites, and affluent suburbanites. But a lot of others, I think, a lot of other voters are more skeptical. It's not to say that they would not support some elements of the Green New Deal and so forth, but it is to say that this notion of central of being able to predict the future and to control it, I think tends to resonate less strongly.
Well, we'll move on to our first question that's discussing how the sort of need that that the GOP needs to reclaim the party from Trump. And the question is surrounding, didn't Trump stand for and impose policies that the GOP had strayed from and failed at affecting before his presidency?
Does it give any examples?
There aren't examples, no, but I think the question is open in general about the need to reclaim the party or reclaim the party from Trump, but that hadn't he affected some of the policies that previous politicians and Republicans had not?
I'll give my view of Trump and Trumpism, which is I think it's actually incredibly hard to define what it actually is. I think 2016 campaign Trump, we all kind of remember what he was going on about at his rallies. But trying to actually characterize the Trump administration in a coherent way turns out to be very difficult. We did a sort of retrospective symposium at American Compass on this back in December, and really just sort of went through what were all the policies he implemented that, either that he wanted to implement or that he implemented. And it's striking, with a few exceptions, trade with China, where he had a very steady U.S. trade representative who was there from the beginning to the end and implementing an approach. With that exception, and actually to Julia's point, I think on foreign policy, there was actually a clearer and somewhat successful shift. But on domestic policy, it's frankly very hard to make sense of what he achieved in a sort of consistent and effective direction. And so that's where I think the joke I make is that you need the Marie Kondo approach to assessing Trump, which is you have to touch each individual thing and decide whether it sparks joy. I think the tendency is either to be pro-Trump and try to sell it all as a coherent package, or be anti-Trump and dismiss it all as irrational fascism. And that just doesn't really hold. The administration was so eclectic in its composition. Trump's own priorities shifted so frequently that you really have to go piece by piece and say, well, was that a good policy? Is that something we should keep? And I think there are absolutely places, as I mentioned, on trade, on some of the sort of environmental regulatory streamlining. I think he did very good work. On some of the cultural issues and the critical race theory type stuff, I think he actually took a stand that a typical Republican probably would not have been willing to. But then I think there are a lot of issues where even things we identify with him, like immigration, I think it's hard to make a case that he really had an effective immigration policy to be carried forward. And I think that's something conservatives need. So I guess I argue for going policy by policy rather than trying to say something about Trump generally. And then the one thing I would say about Trump generally is that he was not an effective executive. And so there is an important element in which whatever comes next has to keep the right ideas, but also say the stylistic leadership that he displayed was not conservative, and in a lot of cases wasn't effective. And is going to have to look different in the future.
What Trump did do, or rather what happened on his watch, was something that Republicans had been promising and had not delivered, or a few things. Agree that it was eclectic, agree that we need to look very carefully at Trump's very complicated legacy. But he ran promising prosperity. He ran telling his voters that the system is rigged and making representations that he was going to make a better, fairer government. And up until the COVID-19 pandemic hit, things looked awfully good. We were seeing wage growth of the sort that we had hoped to see in the bottom quartile, right? Republicans had been promising this, in effect, greater prosperity. And I'm not saying there have been zero successes, but not the successes that Republicans had claimed to stand for. We also saw in 2019, Brad knows more about this than I think, a decline in the child poverty rate, did we not? And so these claims that if we could just get the regulatory boot off of the neck of a lot of hardworking Americans, that we could see some extraordinary prosperity. And that was at the heart of Trump's message. Agree with you that his execution was a bit spotty, but that was at the heart of his message. And he was saying that Republicans should have been the party of wanting to do this and of actually doing this. Now, I actually believe that if Mitt Romney had won in 2012, we would have seen a lot of the stuff that we saw under the Trump administration. I don't think that a lot of the successes we saw in the Trump administration were particular to Trump. But that said, Trump does have some pretty stellar achievements to be proud of.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and skip forward a few questions just because we've gotten a number of questions on this general topic. How will and should a post-Trump conservatism respond to the insurrection that occurred on January 6th?
I mean, I would certainly say, to decry it, obviously, as, a violation of our commitment to the constitutional transfer of power. And this is one example, obviously, of where, Trump, I think, failed in a deep and profound way. So I think it's important for us to maintain and renew our commitment to constitutional norms and principles. And this is one area where the Republican Party has clear work to do, I would say.
I actually think the Republicans should claim the high ground here, or the higher ground, maybe is a better way of putting it. Of course, insurrections, violence, et cetera, are not something that one would support, but this goes to the respect for the rule of law. And when we think about institutions and the importance of understanding institutions, respecting institutions, conserving institutions, innovating when necessary, thinking about Burke's approach now, of course we would not have violence. But, I think the Republicans and conservatives' certain record on this is by and large very good, just as most conservatives respect the limits of executive power, even when there is a Republican president. I don't see the flip-flopping. So I hear conservatives say, no, violence is wrong, whether it's Antifa in the summer, this past summer, causing so much difficulty, or whether it's things getting out of hand on January 6th. This is why I keep saying that conservatives have the higher ground here. I don't see them going back and forth, depending on whether or not it is their group causing the difficulty.
There's a few questions regarding Professor Mahoney's discussion of entitlement reform. For those conservatives who care about the debt and spending, where does the Conservative Party go from here with two spend-happy parties as the national debt approaches $30 trillion?
So
yes,
go ahead.
Yeah, Oren, do you have thoughts of this? We don't have a party of fiscal responsibility, do we?
No, that's certainly true, and I think I was going to connect this to your point, Julia, about the economic success of the Trump administration, which I think you're absolutely right about. I think the problem with it is certainly deregulation helped, but I think by far the most credit has to go to the fact that we ran this aggressively loose monetary policy and the kind of fiscal policy you would run at the depth of a recession at the top of a business cycle. We were running a $1 trillion deficit and sub 2% interest rates 10 years into an expansion. Now, on the pro-Trump side, it was successful in a way that supply side economists would have denied that it could be. It did not have the downsides that are always warned. And at the margin, I think it very clearly proved we need to have a much stronger bias toward running the economy hot and maintaining tight labor markets if we want to get those benefits at the bottom. So I think that's an incredible success and important lesson learned. The flip side of it is, though, you can't just do that indefinitely. And to say, well, we just therefore will be a second party of trillion-dollar deficits, I think is unsustainable. And so one very interesting place that takes us, and this goes to the entitlement point as well, is at some point we're going to have to talk about taxes. I mean, there are certainly places to cut spending in the government, but the idea that sort of, well, we're just going to do another waste, fraud, and abuse campaign and balance the budget is total fiction. If we actually want to provide the sort of entitlement security and even new middle class programs to address the very real problems in the country, we are going to have to pay for that. And there is nothing, in my view, that is not small c conservative about saying those who have the greatest success under a well-functioning social compact have the obligation to then pay in a lot more to support those who are coming behind them or who have had less success. That doesn't mean open-ended welfare, but it does mean a larger funded state that has to collect the taxes to pay for that stuff. And that is obviously a sacred cow that even the folks on the right of center who are pushing toward reform are not ready to talk about yet in a lot of cases. But I don't see a future for a right of center or a conservative Republican Party that keeps signing Grover Norquist's no new taxes ever pledge.
Agreed. There are a couple of areas, though, where I think one might get significant buy-in or significant agreement. One is the extraordinary waste in the healthcare sector. There are a lot of what we classify as healthcare spending has nothing to do with health. It's cronyism run amok. And I believe that not only can technological innovation bend down a lot of cost curves, but we could, in effect, pare down a lot of the healthcare industry. The same goes for the education industry, particularly the higher education industry. This notion that tuitions can climb indefinitely as the government student loans is, I think, absurd. So those are two places where I think cuts are in order and would be popular across the conservative coalition. When it comes to taxes, I think it's a tougher, a heavier lift, but I can certainly imagine a estate tax that does not permit the massive deductions for foundations that we now have, right? We could have a real estate tax that wouldn't raise that much money, but that would certainly be a start. I have other ideas too, in terms of taxes that would be palatable to conservatives.
Our next question says, how do you see conservative criticism of mainstream news outlets playing out in the future? Is there any potential for some kind of renewed trust in media generally, or has a potential for consensus and reform passed?
Yeah, I certainly think that when it comes to mainstream media, when it comes to many other cultural institutions, including universities, that there is obviously a deep and deepening divide between conservatives and these core culture forming institutions, and I don't see, unfortunately, any near-term opportunities to bridge that divide. So I think instead we're going to have to rely upon alternatives and newer efforts when it comes to the media, and even universities and colleges as well, that will be more in keeping with a broadly conservative perspective. And obviously the sort of the Substack explosion is one example, and this is sort of more of this sort of independent-minded centrists, in Substack, but that's one example of kind of the need to form new institutions in the face of our current challenges when it comes to both media and higher education.
Okay, I'm going to try to start combining questions a bit to get through as many as we can in the last few minutes that we have. There's a few questions regarding social conservatism. Is it possible for conservatives to remain truly socially conservative, especially on issues like abortion, if they will also have to court more socially liberal, as Professor Wilcox has described them, barstool conservatives to remain electorally viable?
Yeah, I think there are going to have to be some compromises on some issues. And, I think there's going to be kind of, as Oren was suggesting, kind of a shift away from some of the classic social issues on the Republican side to address, the newer concerns that are now confronting a lot of ordinary Americans in terms of just language and conduct that's seen as inappropriate or, unjust in some quarters today. So I think it's more a question of, or is it more that there'll be kind of maybe a shift in the focus, both in terms of rhetoric and policy on the part of conservatives to address this kind of suite of issues that has been called by Matthew Walther Barstool conservatives. Although he also writes in his article that Barstool conservatives probably more likely to tolerate, if you will, social conservatives than is the left. That's also kind of a point where these two different groups, the Barstool conservatives and the social conservatives, can kind of live together with one another.
Yeah, I don't think that the social conservative issues will be sort of an obstacle. I think they're probably they will become more valuable. And the reason I say that is because, when we talk about a sort of more multi-ethnic working class conservatism, you're talking about a group that's actually quite socially conservative, but is in a sense trapped on the left of center because of economic issues. And so there's a funny way, if you sort of said, well, suppose that Republicans, Democrats actually agreed on the economic issues, what would happen on social issues? I think conservatives would actually be a lot more successful than they are. And so I think as you see and the flip side is, if you think about the sort of more country club, pro-business side of the Republican Party that has really been the dominant partner in the coalition, they hate that. They hate that socially conservative stuff. They sort of try to mix in enough to hold the coalition together, but not a bit more. And so if you see a conservative coalition that's potentially a solid majority governing coalition that swaps out some of the sort of liberal business folks on economic issues in return for a broader working class and multi-ethnic group, because the conservative economic policy changes, I think you actually have, so the socially conservative issues, their valence will change a little bit, but I think they become actually more effective and central to the message in some respects. And that's something you saw with Trump. I mean, Trump's take on social issues was obviously not the standard religious rights, but the sort of political correctness and what you would call more sort of barstool type issues were ones that were widely popular with his base, frankly, across both political parties, whereas they were totally alienating to what we had historically thought of as the core of the Republican Party.
Yes, and just to add a couple of words to what has just been said, I think that many Americans are pro-life and feel quite strongly about it, but recognize that there's a great deal of nuance and special circumstances, and also believe that in terms of passing laws, one has to be very careful about exactly what can be enforced and how. That is, conservatives, because of their practicality, I think, are much less likely to see something that they think is morally wrong and immediately, or even ill-advised, and immediately come to the conclusion that it should be banned with the full coercive power of the state. Conservatives, I know, by and large, are aware of just how complicated a matter it can be to enforce laws, particularly those that don't yet have the hearts and minds of the populace. So this just reinforces what Oren was just saying in terms of how, in terms of social issues, this emerging Republican Party could well be more unified, stronger, and more coherent.
Okay, so I think this will be our last question of the evening. There's a few questions regarding appealing to certain voting blocks and voting populations. What block of voters do you think conservatives have the best chance of engaging with moving forward?
I think we've all kind of articulated in our own ways that we do think that there is kind of a potential here for the Republican Party to move in the direction not just of the white working class, but a broader multiracial working class, sort of constituency. And I think the challenge, of course, is to identify specific policies, but also to use a kind of an updated language in some ways that would be more broadly appealing than some of the things, obviously, and some of the language that Trump himself used.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, the funny thing about Trump, when you look at it, is you could kind of, and this is more a Shakespearean question than a political one, is like, could somebody exist who was 90% of Trump, but not the other 10%? Like, to have someone as iconoclastic and willing to reject norms and not care what the elite thinks, does it have to be someone who's just sort of outright vulgar and prepared to, not accept the results of an election? Or maybe that is the inevitable initial earthquake, but if you were at least designing someone in a lab, it's actually fairly easy to envision someone who made some of the moves he made to become really quite appealing to the working class. And, he made much greater progress with non-white voters than any Republican had since Ford, since Nixon, for decades. But if you could do that while also just taking the edge off the stuff that was just clearly counterproductive and offensive, both to minority groups on the one hand and to particularly, I think, women and more educated women on the other, those two things don't seem in tension. A lot of times you say you have to choose one, right? The coalition invariably, if it has one, it's not going to have the other. That doesn't seem like the case here. And so it seems to me that what the goal has to be for the right of center in building a governing majority is how does it continue and extend on that outreach into the working class and into non-white segments of the working class, while finding a way to recover some of the suburban voters that Trump somewhat gleefully abandoned. And that's kind of the balancing act that I think will determine whether this kind of direction ends up being successful or not.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to the audience for your questions. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of them, but thanks for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this event. Thanks, Oren. Thanks, Brad.